Well, good morning. Welcome to the 128th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We're very pleased today to welcome Michael Beschloss to the Landon podium to join 127 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and opinions on the important public issues of the day. Before introducing Dr. Beschloss, I would like to introduce the other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Al Cochran, Professor of Music and President of the Faculty Senate. Al? Next to him, our student body president, who has, 3 more weeks? Our student body president, Zach Cook, a senior in biological and agricultural engineering. Zach, thanks. On my right, the chairman of the Landon Patrons, Edward Seaton, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, the associate to the president and the chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Well, thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Beschloss is clearly one of America's preeminent historians. His most recent book, The Conquerors, Roosevelt, Truman, and the Destruction of Hitler's Germany, 1941 to 1945, is a widely acclaimed bestseller. He is a regular commentator on the presidency for both PBS, CBS, and many of the cable networks. Among Dr. Beschloss's 7 books are 2 volumes of his work on the Lyndon Johnson presidency. Taking Charge is based on the recently released tapes from the Johnson White House years. The latest one, Reaching for Glory, has been called, quote, an incomparable portrait of a president at work. Very, very fascinating historical work. He has also authored books on the Eisenhower and Kennedy presidencies. Michael is an alumnus of Williams College and Harvard University. He has been a staff historian at the Smithsonian Institution, on the faculty at Oxford University, and a senior fellow at the Annenberg Foundation. He holds 2 honorary doctorates and is a trustee of the White House Historical Association, the National Archives Foundation, and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. Over the years, the Landon Lectures have hosted many of America's most renowned historians, including David McCullough, Stephen Ambrose, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Barbara Tuchman, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Today's speaker, Michael Beschloss, is without question one of America's most well-known and outstanding historians. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Michael Beschloss to the Landon podium.
Thank you very much, John. That could not have been nicer. In fact, when John was talking, he was mentioning the fact that I sometimes on PBS on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Jim Lehrer being a great Kansan from Wichita, born in Wichita, who takes his Kansas roots extremely seriously. And when John was talking, it reminded me of the guy who once said about PBS, public broadcasting, that PBS comes in 5 parts. He said the 5 parts are animals talking, English people talking, animals mating, English people mating, and the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. So I could have probably saved John a little bit of time by just coming up and saying I'm the one from category 5. I should probably actually elaborate on how Jim came to put historians regularly on television, and what that was in 1973, the Senate Watergate hearings were going on in Washington, and he was new to PBS. He went from Kansas to Texas and then finally to Washington, and he was anchoring the Watergate hearings on PBS with Robin McNeil. And he had always had this idea that they should use historians more on television to talk about the precedents for an historic event like Watergate. So they had an intermission of about 4 minutes in the hearings, and they thought, why not put an historian on? Does Watergate remind us of anything in history? And he chose a previous Landon lecturer, Barbara Tuchman, a wonderful choice, but what he forgot was that Mrs. Tuchman was known for writing these excellent but very long books, and he had only 4 minutes. And so what happened was, as he tells the story, you know, the intermission began, and he said, Mrs. Tuchman, does Watergate remind you of anything in history? And she said, yes, Jim, it does. And to understand Watergate, you have to go back to the 14th century. And she began to talk, and 1 minute passed, and 2 minutes, and finally it was near to about 4 minutes, and he was relieved because it was getting to be the end of the time, at which point she said, now, Jim, that brings us to the 15th century. And the result was that Jim Lehrer did not put historians regularly on television for something like about 20 more years. So I was lucky to beat the statute of limitations. John was a colleague of Hubert Humphrey, senator and vice president from Minnesota years ago. It reminds me a little bit. Humphrey, as John I think will confirm, was also known for not talking very briefly. And Humphrey was once giving a speech, and it went on, and finally Humphrey knew that he was way over time, and he said, has anyone got a watch? And someone yelled out of the audience, how about a calendar? So I will try to stay within time. Anyway, I want to thank Al and Zach for being kind enough to be here this morning, and want to thank Edward for everything he does for this program, and especially Chuck Reagan, who's been a wonderful friend to me during the last day, and I know he's done so much to make this program a success over the last number of years. And another great pleasure of my visit here has been to have the privilege of being with your great president. John is not only a world-class leader and a great historian, but I've been learning more and more about what he's been doing here at Kansas State, and looking very much forward to reading the wonderful book that's been written about that I've been hearing about before I came here. Usually you don't get these things in real time. We historians have to wait a number of years, so I'm so glad to have it between hardcovers, and thank him so much for being here this morning. And also want to say how honored I am to speak in the name of Alfred M. Landon. You could say a lot about him. I'm sure a lot about him has been said by the 128 Landon lecturers. And I think probably very little that I can add except for a few things. And one is that especially in these times, you have to look at how unusual this career was. This was a man who ran for president in 1936, said exactly what he thought, didn't have posters, didn't have consultants, spoke very much from his viscera, saying things that in many ways were unpopular in 1936, but things which he believed deeply, which resulted in him not being elected president. And where I live in Washington, that's about the most cardinal sin you can commit, is to say something that might impede you from being elected to office, especially the presidency. I see it as a towering sign of character and something that we should look back at Alfred Landon as a model for the political figures of our own time. And the other thing that strikes me most of all is this. When he lost that election, he came back to where he was from, and he served for about 60 more years as a great national figure and leader, not only in Kansas, but a model for the rest of us Americans. He didn't lie in bed every morning at 2 a.m. wondering whether he should have had more time campaigning in Ohio, whether that would have brought him the election. He didn't agonize over the fact that he was not president. This was a person of parts who could run for president, didn't make it, and led a very full and contributing life for the rest of his life, and very much in my mind in the spirit of the founders, who had the idea that you have public service. Cincinnatus leaves his plow and has a spell of public service, and then goes back to his normal life and serves perhaps as richly, in certain ways even more, than he might have had he been president. So I think that's a very great tribute to Alfred Landon, and I think it's a wonderful thing that this lecture has been such an enormous success over the last 3 or more decades. And I couldn't be more honored to speak in his name this morning. I guess while I'm amending a little bit what John said, I should probably tell about the first time I actually saw a real live president, which was in 1960, Richard Nixon. And I was growing up in Cook County, Illinois. I was about 4 years old. And Nixon was in a motorcade on a highway, and as I remember being told later on, I don't remember it myself, when I was 4, I was held up in the air as Nixon's Cadillac rolled by, and that was the first time I saw a president, although in Nixon's case it was a future president. And it turned out there was a method to the madness, because that was the fall that a few here will remember, that Nixon was giving this speech saying, "Elect me president, your children will not grow up under communism." And they wanted local Republican parents to bring their small kids as theatrical props held up in the air as examples of the future non-communists if Nixon was elected. And Nixon was not elected that year, but he was in 1968, and I did not turn out to be a communist, so that was a campaign promise that was kept by a presidential candidate. And so anyway, time passed, and the first time I actually saw Nixon in close quarters was I was writing a book with a co-author on the end of the Cold War, and we went up to see Nixon in northern New Jersey, and I think it was February of 1992. And one problem with being a presidential historian is that we know about 1 million times more things about these presidents and former presidents than they know about us, so unless we contain ourselves and sort of put a stopper on all we know, these conversations are going to be very one-sided. And so I forgot my lesson the second I got there, because I went to Nixon's house, and he was living at that time, it was the end of his life, in an attached townhouse, northern New Jersey, and took me up in the elevator to the 4th floor to his library to have drinks before lunch. And I saw a set of golf clubs leaning against one of the walls, and I said, "Mr. President, I thought you had given up golf." He said, "Yes, well, ever since I had a hole-in-one." And I was boorish enough to interrupt and say, "Yes, wasn't that in 1961 with the actor Randolph Scott?" And he gave me the strangest look I think I've ever received. And I said to myself, "You'd better be very quiet, or else this is going to be not a very edifying experience." So I was on good behavior until we sat down to lunch. And that was the time I thought it might be nice to tell him what I hoped he would find, this charming little story about my having seen him in the motorcade in Cook County, Illinois, when I was 4 in 1960. So I said, "Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we have met before." And I told him of seeing him in the motorcade. He fell dead silent, immediately changed the subject, and didn't refer to what I had said for the rest of the lunch. And I thought I had committed some horrible social faux pas. And so when I got home, I called a friend who knew Nixon and said, "What did I do wrong?" And he said, "I'll find out and tell you." Called me a couple of days later, said, "It turns out you struck out 3 times. I said, "What did I do now?" He said, "Number one, these days Nixon is interested in the present and the past, present and the future, not the past, so you brought up what he considered to be ancient history, strike 1. He said, "Strike 2, just in case Nixon, through some strange fluke, felt like talking about ancient history, the ancient history he would like to discuss would not be the 1960 campaign, which he lost to John Kennedy." And he said, "Strike 3, just in case he, through some really bizarre lapse, wanted to discuss ancient history and the '60 campaign, the place he would really like to discuss would not be Cook County, Illinois, where he feels the ballots were stolen that gave the election to John Kennedy." I don't know if there's a lesson in any of this, except for that in all of our careers, even historians who write about presidents, there is involved some modicum, I guess, of personal diplomacy. This grew up when I was doing this project that John was kind enough to mention, these 2 volumes on the tapes that Lyndon Johnson made. He had this, it turns out, secret taping system that taped a lot of his private conversations. As it turned out, 10,000 of them from his first moment in the presidency to the very end. His wife did not know that she was being taped. His children did not. His close aides, in many cases, did not either. And when I began doing these books, I would run into a Johnson aide and say, "Isn't it great? It turns out your boss taped all of your private conversations with him in secret. Aren't you glad those will be in my book?" And the guy would sort of look like the deer in the headlights, wondering what things he might have told LBJ many years ago that he would not want to wind up between cloth covers. But the problem with writing about any president, and I think this is true of historians in general, I know that John has been studying Genghis Khan. I know this did not happen with him, fortunately, but oftentimes an historian will take on the characteristics of the person that you're writing about, which I think would not be a great idea in the case of Genghis Khan. John has a great sense of proportion. Probably would be okay if you're writing about Mahatma Gandhi. My problem is I was writing about LBJ, and it's not Genghis Khan, but there were some problems if I turned into a living replica of Lyndon Johnson and took out on his way of doing things. One case in point, Johnson once asked one of his speechwriters to come in with a speech for an occasion that Johnson had to speak to. And he came in with a speech, and Johnson looked at the text, and he said, well, the text is okay. And it had a big quotation at the beginning. Charles will be delighted to hear as a philosopher. The quotation at the beginning was from Aristotle, said, as Aristotle said, and then a long quotation. So Johnson said, well, the speech text is fine, and I like the quotation, but he said, no one in the audience will know who the hell Aristotle was. So he said, just keep the quotation and change it to, as my daddy said. It's the kind of thing. It worked fine for LBJ. It would not do wonders for me if I took on this way of doing things. Another example is the language. I mean, listening to these tapes over and over again, you can begin to talk like the person that you're listening to. And LBJ, I guess the best thing you can say is he was incapable of speaking an uninteresting sentence. I'll give an example or two, and I apologize in advance for the language, but I want to be accurate. He will, for instance, he will never say, John Jones is nervous. He will say, John Jones is nervous as a whore in church. Or he spent about 2 days with a Scandinavian king who, granted, was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and Johnson was a very smart man. But at the end of the 2 days, he practically pushed the guy onto the helicopter, and he threw an arm around a young aide and said, boy, I knew they made dumb kings. I just never knew they made kings that dumb. And I guess my all-time favorite is that Johnson in early 1965 was talking to John's old friend Hubert Humphrey. And one problem with trying to sort of decipher the Johnson tapes is that, you know, I'm from Illinois, not from Texas, so the accent is sometimes lost on me, especially when Johnson is talking late at night and you can hear the ice sort of rattling around in a glass. The accent gets thicker and thicker. And the other thing is that there are just a lot of Texas expressions that we just don't use in Illinois, and I finally formed a circle of Texas friends to help me decipher when it was needed. And they were pretty good, but there was one that stumped us all, and that was this. Spring of '65, he was talking to John's friend, Hubert Humphrey, who by then was vice president, and Johnson says, Hubert, that Medicare bill is going to go through Congress faster than a dose of salt through a widow woman. And that stumped everyone. You know, someone thought maybe, you know, widows cry, so you have to replace the salt in their tears. It didn't sound right to us, and so finally, you know, if I gave a lecture in Texas, I would say, if there's anyone here who has any idea what this means, if they could meet me at the back of the hall. And finally, this very nice lady came up to me and said, young man, don't you realize that in Texas, ladies in Lyndon's boyhood oftentimes used Epsom salts as laxatives? I mean, of all the things I never expected to have to understand when I became an historian, this probably is the best example of that, but shows you how difficult the work is. Perhaps the final example is this. When you're dealing with something like the Johnson tapes, I finally had to decipher them myself and actually transcribe them, because there were transcripts that were done by secretaries, but these were very inaccurate because they were working under great pressure and working it late at night because Johnson didn't want anyone to know that he taped these conversations. The moment I found that I had to transcribe them myself, and this is what you oftentimes encounter in historical sources, according to the transcript, it was about 10 days into Johnson's presidency. He was talking to the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, and the secretary had transcribed what he said as, John, I can't talk to you long because I have in my waiting room waiting for me a pack of bastards. I apologize for the language, but that's what it said in the transcript. And I said, well, if that's what he said, I'll put it in the book. But I actually listened to the tape myself and looked at his daily schedule. Turned out what he had actually said was, I have waiting for me in my waiting room the Pakistan ambassador. And gives you a little bit of an idea of how difficult this is. And, you know, when I was doing it, I sort of figured, it was not an irrational mistake for the secretary to make. I mean, she had worked for him for 30 years and knew the way that the guy talked. And the other thing was, just before he became president, probably much more common among his visitors were packs of bastards than Pakistani ambassadors. So it shows you have to sometimes substitute your own judgment. What I thought I would talk about this morning and try to keep within time so we'll have some time for questions is what history brings to the table that we don't always know in real time. For instance, here we are at what seems to be a very historic moment. We seem as if we're on the brink of a war with Iraq. We have cable television channels, we have superb newspapers like Edwards, we have probably coverage of a president of a kind that we've never had before with this intensity in American history. Yet at the same time, as we're watching all this, we have to always keep in mind that no matter what judgments we may form about George Bush and a war in Iraq during the next 90 days or so, they're likely to be very different from the kind of judgments an historian might have 20 or 30 years from now. And there are two reasons for that. One is we don't have the information that we're going to have 20 years from now because we will get presumably private memos and letters and diaries, the kind of stuff that shows us what's going on in a president's mind and what's going on behind the scenes. But much more important than that, 20 years from now, we're going to have the essential ingredient, and that is hindsight. We will know how the story turned out. We will know what followed. We will know how important certain things seem in the hindsight of history, which Barbara Tuchman once called in this wonderful image, the lantern on the stern of the boat that shows you what went behind. And the information is crucial. I was talking about the Johnson tapes. These things show us all sorts of things about Lyndon Johnson that we never could have dreamt of, we never could have known at the time. One of them is that in 1965, when he was sending American boys and some women to Vietnam and saying, nail the coonskin on the wall and America wins the war as she fights, in private, he was saying, I don't think we can win this war. He was telling his Secretary of Defense in February of 1965, I can't think of anything worse than losing the war in Vietnam, and I don't see any way that we can win. That's something that no one knew in 1965, and had they known, it would have thrown a very different light on the events of the time. It's not always this grave and serious. Dwight Eisenhower, another great son of Kansas, used to give these wonderful press conferences in which his grammar was not wonderful, to put it mildly, and people would think that this was a president not very much on top of his job. Long afterwards, we got records showing how intelligent Eisenhower was and the fact that he oftentimes put on those performances to distract people. There was this one scene where Eisenhower was about to tell his press secretary, Jim Hagerty, what to say about Taiwan in a press conference. And he gave him the answer to give, and Hagerty said, I can't give that answer, boss. You know, the press boys will give me hell. And Eisenhower, with that wonderful smile, threw his arm around Hagerty's shoulder and said, my boy, better you than me. Kind of thing we didn't know at the time. Adlai Stevenson, who in my state of Illinois was this great figure, I found much later from his aides that he was not much of a campaigner. One of his aides told me in 1956 they were campaigning with Stevenson, wasn't going well. Stevenson said, what am I doing wrong? And the aide said, here's what's wrong, Governor. This morning, that little girl handed you a stuffed dead baby alligator. This was Florida. And what you should have said was, thank you, little girl, it's just what I wanted for my living room, instead of what you did say, Governor, which was, for Christ's sake, what's this? It's the kind of thing, long afterwards, gives you an idea. John Kennedy in 1963 was meeting with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Harold Macmillan. And in the newspapers, including, I'm sure, probably Edwards, they were basing the reports on what was given out by the White House. Macmillan and Kennedy discussed bilateral issues like the Cold War and arms control, and so they did. But only long afterwards did we get exact records of what was really said in the conversation. And it turned out that Kennedy had gone on at great length complaining about the fact that Jackie, his wife, was getting really bad press coverage. And Macmillan, who was a generation older, said, Jack, what do you care? Just brush it off, doesn't matter. And Kennedy said, well, that's easy for you to say. How would you like it if the press said that your wife, Dorothy, is a drunk? And Macmillan's reply was, I would simply reply, you should have seen her mother. It's a kind of thing that gives you an idea long afterwards, but you don't get it in real time. And it's also important, too, because, as I say, these things oftentimes show you things about presidents that really do bear on their reputations. Harry Truman is perhaps the best example. If we were evaluating Harry Truman perhaps in 1953, he went back to Missouri after his presidency with a poll rating that was probably in the teens, which would be like about a 5% rating nowadays because people respected presidents very much in those days. And he was seen at the time someone who was unpopular. Adlai Stevenson would not campaign with him because he thought that Truman was a burden. He was seen as the architect of an unpopular war in Korea. His entourage was brushed with minor corruption. Truman, by most Americans and many historians in '53, was not seen as a great president. Here we are exactly 50 years later. Most historians, and I think most Americans, would see Truman as a very great man. Why is that? One reason is we have information. We now know in private the kind of conviction and honesty and modesty and common sense that were in that man that were admirable. But the more important thing is hindsight. We now have 50 years of hindsight. We know how the Cold War turned out, and we know that America won the Cold War because we and about a dozen Cold War presidents adhered to a strategy that Harry Truman devised in the late 40s and early 50s, the Marshall Plan, NATO, containment, aspects of the United Nations. And since it was that strategy that allowed us to defeat the Soviet Union and live in a different world today, you have to see Harry Truman as a great man in a way that we never could have dreamt in 1953. So my point is this: as we're looking at George W. Bush and a very likely war with Iraq, let's make judgments, let's react to it as we always should as citizens, but always hold back a little bit and remember that there are a lot of things that we don't know about what's going on right now behind the scenes, and there are a lot of things that we can't know because we are not prophets. We do not know what's going to go on in the next 20 years or even in the next 90 days. So I think that really brings us to the final question, and that is that's all great for an historian who has the luxury of dealing with people and events 20 years later, but what do we as citizens do? We have to make judgments about presidents and citizens in real time. We can't afford to wait until their papers come out or when historians write about them, because it's going to be much too late for us to vote or talk to a pollster about what we think about what a president is doing. And I would say this: if you go back and look at presidents in their time, perhaps one of the most important things that you could really see in real time is this. Is this a president of deep conviction who is willing to take a risk, perhaps even with his political career, in the service of that conviction? Look at Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. He was running for a third term as president. I guarantee you his pollsters were saying, the country is isolationist, especially a place like Kansas. Don't say what you really feel, which is that we might have to fight Hitler and the Japanese, we have to prepare our defense. Instead give speeches saying, you're isolationist like everyone else. Do that to get elected. And Roosevelt, to his great credit, instead said, it's very important that I tell the people where I stand, prepare our defense. Unless we prepare now, we will lose World War II if we have to fight it. And so that would have been true. Had he not been that politically courageous, we would have lost World War II against the Germans and the Japanese. We would be living in a very different world today. Some of us might not be here. Kennedy and Johnson in the 1960s were heavily advised, stay away from a civil rights bill to integrate hotels and restaurants. It's unpopular. In Kennedy's case, in 1960, I think John will confirm this, if you look at the Electoral College vote, Kennedy only became president because a number of southern states were in his column. By sending a civil rights bill to Congress, he lost the white South, put himself in great jeopardy of being defeated for re-election in 1964, yet he did it. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for the presidency, he felt that the Soviet Empire was beginning to topple. There was a chance to end the Cold War in our lifetimes, and to do that by increasing the defense budget and going to strategic defense and making it clear that America had regained its will and was going to contest the Soviet Union in every theater. And his aides during the '80 campaign said, Governor Reagan, You know, don't say these things, they scare people, they'll lose your votes. If you want to do it, fine, but just don't say it during the campaign. And Reagan, with great principle, said the people have a right to know where I stand, and if I'm elected on that platform, the Congress will have to go along with these things because they will realize that I will have a mandate and maybe we can end the Cold War, and that is exactly what happened in retrospect. We now increasingly know, I think, that what Reagan did during the 1980s had a lot to do with the ending of the Cold War, but I think what you could know in real time was that here was a politician who had guts and who had a great sense of conviction and who was willing to perhaps even put his political career on the line out of that sense of conviction. And I think you can see that exactly in George W. Bush right now. Whatever anyone thinks about the war with Iraq, if it comes, this is not something that someone would do out of political timidity. What the consultants would probably say is, this can bounce in almost any direction. It's much safer for you to sort of run the clock, do something that might not jeopardize your reelection in 2004. So I think that's the kind of thing that we can look for in presidents in real time. And maybe one story from the Johnson tapes, just since we're near the end of our time, I think makes the point. And that is, in the spring of 1964, LBJ was dealing with the Civil Rights Act. And when Johnson became president, this was November 22nd, 1963, after John Kennedy's murder in Dallas, flew back to Washington. He met with his new cabinet. He went back to his house in Northwest Washington. In those days, unlike the days of Dick Cheney, a vice president was so unimportant, didn't have an official residence, just had his own house, and his telephone number was listed in the telephone book. So there's Johnson, he's just become president, and these neighbors whom he barely knew are calling up saying, gee, Landon, want to wish you all kinds of good luck, which was lovely, but he had a few things to do. And so finally he called his aides back into his bedroom and said, it was midnight, you know, what do I have to worry about? And they said, boss, you know, the thing you really have to worry about is the civil rights bill that John Kennedy sent to Congress. Made him very unpopular in the South, possibly meant that he could not have been reelected in 1964. You have every excuse to say, you know, I'm a new president, I need a year to consolidate my authority, set it aside, get safely reelected, and then pass the bill in 1965. And Johnson, to his enormous credit, replied, what the hell is the presidency for if I can't use it for civil rights? Absolutely elemental. It's exactly, I am certain, of the kind of statement that a President Alf Landon would have made in the late 1930s had he been confronted with another controversial issue on which he felt strongly. And in the spring of 1964, LBJ was on the telephone trying to get this civil rights bill passed, and he had been majority leader of the Senate, and he was talking on the telephone to the minority leader of the Senate, who was a man named Everett Dirksen, who was the senator from my home state of Illinois, whom I remember as a kid, we used to watch on television, my brother and I. We thought he sounded like Mr. Ed. And listening to these tapes, he sounded exactly like Mr. Ed. And Johnson and Dirksen knew each other extremely well. It was the kind of relationship that senators had in those days, when senators spent a lot of time together on the Hill and didn't have to raise money and race back to their states and be on TV. And I so remember a story that was told to me by Howard Baker, who was his son-in-law and now the husband of Alf Landon's daughter, Nancy, just to bring this into the Landon milieu. And Senator Baker tells the story about the fact that when he was a congressman, I believe he was a congressman still, he was sitting in his father-in-law's office on the Hill, and suddenly he saw a beagle dog come into the door, which was followed by a leash, which was followed by President Lyndon Johnson, who had come up to the Hill to talk to Everett Dirksen, and he was ready to deal in horse trade. That's what this relationship was, and it did some wonderful things for the country. And the one I'm thinking of is this. Spring of '64, Johnson calls up Dirksen and essentially says, Ev, I need your help on the civil rights bill because the Southern Democrats are going to be against it, and I need Republican votes. And he essentially says, not verbatim, but the essence of it is, he says, Ev, I know you've got some doubts, but look at it this way. This bill passes, it's going to change the country and make history, and if all that happens, everyone will give credit to you. And if it happens 100 years from now, the school children of America will know exactly two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And Dirksen heard that, and he liked what he heard, and I think it was not the only reason, but he supported the Civil Rights Bill and it passed, and history was changed. And my guess is that even despite some wonderful faculty members here at K-State, not everyone knows the name of Everett Dirksen, but I've got two little boys who are 8 and 6, and I can at least assure you that my two little boys will. Thank you all very much.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for a superb presentation. We appreciate it so much. Thank you for coming to Kansas State University to deliver this Landon lecture. Well, as we normally do, if you have questions, if you could move to your left or to your right, and we would just call on you, and I know he'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have. Do we have somebody over here? Please.
Yeah, actually, I got about 200 questions, but I'll limit myself.
Well, that's
actually,
all right.
Well, actually, first a comment, though.
I'll give the tough ones to John.
I've heard you talk about, on this book tour, about how among the reasons given why FDR wouldn't bomb the concentration camps in Germany is because he was afraid of, talking about political risk, of turning the fight, for all Americans into a fight, for the Jews. However, he did have the precedent of Lincoln, who had, who turned the Civil War into a fight, for maintaining the Union into a fight, explicitly for freeing the slaves.
He did.
So I find that interesting. But anyway, to my two comments, or my two questions. One, do you think Khrushchev, being the elder statesman during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had a better appreciation for the gravity of the situation and should have a bigger hero status in that, allowing himself to publicly be the fall guy? He saved the world, but it cost him his political career.
It's so interesting. We were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night, and that is, we were talking about whether this is a more dangerous moment than the moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which we've thought of in the last 40 years, or at least most of us, as perhaps the most dangerous moment of the last half century, because here you had these two countries in confrontation that could have, if it spiraled fast, ended up with the incineration of the Northern Hemisphere. But in a way, and I don't want to make an alarmist comment because, as I say, we historians are only responsible for the past and not the future, so that lets me off the hook in terms of predicting what might happen in Iraq, thank God. I think that should be reserved for people with the expertise. But the thing is that if you think of the number of things that are involved in this crisis that we're now in, not only Iraq and the Middle East, but what might happen between Pakistan and India and North Korea, and even the Chinese and Taiwan, in a way, I don't long for the days of the Cold War in any way, but you compare this to a time when we were looking at Kennedy versus Khrushchev. Khrushchev deserves great criticism, needless to say, for having taken this enormous gamble of sneaking missiles into Cuba, knowing that there was at least the chance that Kennedy would see that as tantamount to an active war and go into a worldwide nuclear confrontation that, if there had been an accident, could have led to a nuclear war that would have killed tens of millions of people. But look at the people involved. Khrushchev, although he was uneducated, and although he was given to risky strategies like the one I've just mentioned, at base, this was a serious person who knew the dangers of a nuclear war and who knew, as has been said so often by our presidents, including Ronald Reagan, that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. He understood that instinctively, so did John Kennedy. I'm not so sure that the leader of North Korea does, and I'm not so sure that some other leaders do. And in a way, you look back on that, and not with any nostalgia. But in terms of your question, does Khrushchev deserve more credit for, in certain ways, saving the human race? Sure. If it had been Stalin at the controls, I'm not sure that the crisis would have ended so happily.
Something you said. Seymour Hersh writes in his book, Dark Side of Camelot, he sort of blames Kennedy for, relentlessly going after Castro, for Castro getting the missiles. I mean, do you agree with that, or?
I wrote a 900-page book on this subject,
Okay.
and since I told about Barbara Tuchman not going on at great length, you're tempting me hugely. The 30-second version would be this. I feel, and sort of wrote in that book after a lot of thought, that Kennedy made a lot of mistakes that compelled Khrushchev to put the missiles in Cuba, and that in many ways he was responsible for creating a crisis that another president might not have. But at the same time, once the crisis was there, I probably would want John Kennedy as my crisis manager, managing this thing day after day, making sure that a U-2 doesn't fly into the wrong place that convinces the Soviets that we're about to make war. So he was very green and inexperienced in a way that almost caused us to lose it all. Once the crisis began, I think he really did mainly redeem himself.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Two great questions.
Is there a question over here?
Well, I got more.
Okay, you're doing great. Thanks.
I mean, actually, I have a question just about being a historian. I was wondering, I mean, you know, people's memories are faulty. When you were translating the LBJ tapes, did you find a discrepancy between what people remembered and what was actually on the tapes? And then how does this affect you as a historian? Because now you're interviewing people about history, and then...
It's what we are doing all the time. In a way, historians are sort of like lawyers in that we're almost taking depositions from people or reading, you know, things that they have written. In some cases, we interview. In some cases, we find other sources. And you're always, you know, it's like Rashomon. You're always wondering, what is the real truth? You know, who's telling the truth? Whose memory is good? You know, who might be shading it? Who might have a certain point of view that's causing him or her to sort of screen what they're telling you or what you remember, what they remember. And one value of a source like these tapes is this is about as primary a source as it gets, because you're listening to these actual voices. You know, you're listening to LBJ talking to Robert Kennedy in 1964. You're hearing exactly what they said, the tone of voice, the noises in the background, not what they thought they said years later or remembered or wanted to tell you. And it's interesting because when I did these books, which are largely excerpts from these tapes with sort of explanatory comment by me, I thought, well, maybe if the people are still alive, I should go to them and say, you know, what was on your mind as you were saying this? And then I realized that I had better not, because if I did that, I'd have to give the same privilege to every living person who was on these tapes, or maybe their relatives. And the result would be, you know, it would be like the congressional record. Everyone would be revising and extending something fierce. You know, no, I didn't mean to say, let's bomb the North Vietnamese. I meant, let's get out because this war could last till 1973 and could be a tragedy for America. You know, then you're basically doing a book of people's excuses or sort of spun versions of what they actually said on the tape. So that's why it's great to have a primary source. And you know, the first tape I listened to was November 22nd, 1963, day of the Kennedy assassination. What happened was Johnson was in that motorcade in Dallas, was rushed to Parkland Hospital, was told that John Kennedy was dead, was told to get to Air Force One at Love Field because there was some concern that this might be the spearhead of a Soviet attack, and therefore they wanted him in the air quickly so that he could go above a nuclear attack in case that's what the Russians had in mind. So he gets on the plane. Jacqueline Kennedy gets on the plane with the president's coffin. He's sworn in. Johnson says, let's get this plane airborne. And in those days, radio traffic from Air Force One went through Andrews Air Force Base. Young officers snapped on a tape recorder. So I was the first one, I think, to hear this tape in about 35 years. And you hear, it's absolutely eerie. It's the first minutes of this flight from Dallas back to Washington. You hear the nervous aides, people crying. Johnson says, I'd like to speak to Mrs. Kennedy, Rose Kennedy, on the telephone. And then you hear her voice, and she's on the verge of weeping. And Johnson says, you know, we're grieving with you, and the country is lucky to have your son as long as it did. Both he and Lady Bird say this. And she's so overcome that, understandably, she has to get off the telephone line. And had we had a primary source like that about able to listen to the words of Lincoln at the time of Fort Sumter, or FDR at Pearl Harbor, or George W. Bush on 9/11, think of how much that could tell us. Do we have time for perhaps one more?
Enjoyed your lecture very much. Could you sketch out your analysis of the role of the Clinton administration in the time between the Bushes with regard to the Middle East?
With regard to the Middle East. I hate to sound as if I'm copping out, but that's exactly sort of an example of what I'm thinking about, because to really understand that whole as an historian, you know, you'd have to see the cables, you'd have to know what kind of back-channel negotiations were going on, and most important of all, you'd have to know what happened during the 10 or 15 years after Bill Clinton left office. And in a way, that's the best example of all, because if you're trying to evaluate Bill Clinton's foreign policy, for instance, a lot of people made a lot of judgments about that as late as the summer of 2001. But think how different a judgment would be of Bill Clinton's foreign policy in the summer of 2001, before 9/11 and everything that followed occurred, versus even discussing it now, knowing how the story began to turn out. That's what I mean by, in terms of needing historical hindsight. Can I close with one story quickly? This is not always so grave. I was talking about on the Johnson tapes and how you find out things later on. Final example I'll give you, it's a little bit more of an amusing one. Summer of '64, Johnson was on the ranch, and again, the communique was given. President spent the day on Vietnam and civil rights. Turned out the biggest thing he did, and it's on these tapes, is he ordered a pair of trousers from the head of Hagar Slacks. He always went to the top man. And he says to the guy on the tape, it's just the kind of thing Johnson would hate being publicized or anyone ever hearing. You know, he's saying, you know, I like your store-bought Hagar Slacks, but I need some custom-made because these are not comfortable. And he goes into extreme anatomical detail to describe why the trousers are not comfortable. He says they're like riding a wire fence. And so, anyway, you know, it went into the book, and I saw Lady Bird after this book came out a few years ago, and I said, you know, were you happy with the way the book was received? And she said, well, to be honest, I probably could have lived without reading the Hagar Slacks conversation and hearing it on television, but you should know it's my grandchildren's favorite. And the final denouement was about a month later, I got a letter from old Mr. Hagar, who was about 92, offering me a free pair of Hagar Slacks. So who says there are no perks for his